Hello, everybody. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. Welcome to ICC's live recap of rounds 10 through 12 of the Candidates Tournament from Berlin. The 12th round completely turned the story of the tournament upside down. When I started working on this segment, it seemed like a big deal when Caruana held a slightly worse position against Mamedyarov to maintain his half-point lead. That was 2 rounds ago. After round 12, the lead is gone, but not to Mamedyarov, but to Karjakin, who has somehow managed to make a huge comeback after starting the tournament with 2 early losses. He has managed to claw his way to the top. And so we're going to start with the headline game where Karjakin defeated the tournament leader, Fabiano Caruana, to catch him up. And let's see how he did it. All right, so Caruana goes for a Petrov's defense. And of course, you know, it's a kind of a must-win situation for Karjakin. It's kind of a must-draw situation for Caruana because he's playing a guy who's a point behind him. If he holds him off, you know, even if he loses a game after that, at least, you know, Karjakin isn't necessarily going to pick up a whole point in the transaction and the tiebreak advantage. So this is a really, really important game. And so Caruana, certainly a draw would work well for him. So they play a very main line of the Petrovs. And I think that lately a lot of black players have gone this kind of route where to also castle queenside, so we don't have the competing attacks. Certainly, if you want to draw, that's nice to take kingside attack out of it. So bishop e6, castle. It's actually possible for black to try to grab this pawn on a2. It's a you know, piece sacrifice. Go a5, a4, sacrifice a piece, be probably a great thing to do if you're a point behind, but Caruana just plays it conservatively, as almost every grandmaster does. Now Karjakin plays a3. King b1 is more common. Of course, either move protects the pawn on a2. So there aren't very many games from here, a3 and after h6. So very surprisingly, after this move, knight d4, we have a new position. All right, so knight d4, we have a trade, hitting the pawn on g7, and black plays rook g8. So this is not really a huge concession because black is intending to castle queenside, although he will have to clean up some things over there. So bishop e2, and so as to not lose any more time, Caruana goes and attacks the bishop, loosens up his pawn structure a little bit, but also gains some activity by bringing these pawns forward. And there finally gets castled. Bishop f3. And now we really have the key moment in the game. For Fabiano has a choice. He can play, probably what he should play is f5. That's one of the computer recommended moves. It does kill the bishop on e6 a little bit, but also kills the bishop on e3 a little bit, as a pawn f4 is now firmly blocked. And if white has an advantage in this position, it's probably pretty slim. You know, maybe the line's a little bit more open to the black king, but you know, the material on the board, there's still a lot of material on the board, so this play, but you know, black, it's a position you expect a grandmaster to hold. Bishop g4, unfortunately, was met by this exchange sacrifice, bishop takes d5, and afterwards, Caruana lamented that move, bishop g4, said he just should not have done it, and I have to totally agree about that, because after this exchange sacrifice, it's one of those things that doesn't really push the needle. The engines still say the position is slightly better for white, either way. But this is definitely much more pleasant for white to play. This bishop on d5 is very powerful. White can root it in there with c4, and black has very little play. White has the bishop pair, and basically black is waiting around, and that's a very dangerous situation when you're waiting around and you don't have, really much to do. B6, so this frees the bishop to move, but there is a potential problem. The queen getting in there, the queen never gets in front of the bishop. Black can't really guard the light squares. G4, bishop F6, and king B1. Now, there's an idea for black to at some point sacrifice the exchange to set up bishop's opposite color position, and if he could find a way to liquidate, like if he could trade a pair of rooks or trade the queens, it would be worth giving up the exchange to be able to hold that ending. Even if he had to give up a second pawn, he could certainly do it, because the extra pawn on the queen side White isn't likely to make a pass pawn with that. But there's just no way to do it. He can sacrifice the exchange now, but it doesn't lead to anything. White's bishop is still very strong in the center. So Fabiano waits. But I think he should have waited more. The G5 move turns out to be a weakness. Of course, White is getting ready to play G5. He can play Rook D7, G5, and unfortunately, there's no way for Black to trade to sack the exchange and then get Queen E5 and trade queens. Rook E3, Rook E3, Rook E3. White can take the bishop on F6 is winning. Or even taking the rook is good, because Queen E5, White has a check. So, Black just has to play Bishop E5. But I think that this is definitely better than what he did. He can follow up with G6. He has almost a fortress position, but at the same time, White has ideas like Bishop G2 and maybe Queen F3, and it's still going to be uncomfortable for Black. But I think this is a better way to play. He can play Rook D8 and trade a pair of rooks. It's an uncomfortable position sitting for Black, but it's a better version than what he got. I think G5, he was trying to be proactive and not get too passive, but this turned out to be a real weakness. It doesn't force anything. White put his king in a safe position, and then he plays his move Queen F1, which everybody liked very much. I guess the idea is maybe to threaten Rook H3, and Black's pawns become very vulnerable. And so basically now the game gets away from Black. It really is that one mistake G5, and it didn't take much. Now he drops his pawn on G5, and now White has a nice pass pawn on the H-file. Practically speaking, the position starts to become lost. I think Black, the last chance really was to block with F6. Still a big advantage for White. Not necessarily winning, probably in a practical sense winning. But now G5, the H-pawn is free to move. And really White can just take his time. Black can only just wait around. There are various tactics happening. Karjakin takes his time, Rook D2, Rook F2 ideas, and Caruana makes desperate move B5, and now he goes for Bishop F7 because he has a very simple plan. He just starts trading stuff. He could play other ways too, but this is very simple. Goes G6, threatening to queen. King has to come back this way, and now he takes the pawn on B5. All right, so Black is able to clean up the H-pawn, but the problem is that now White has this majority on the queen side, and Black is able to stop pawns on both sides, but the problem is it's all he can do. And now the king has to stay on the queen side, otherwise B6 will queen a pawn. So basically the white king is just going to saunter over to the king side to support the G pawn and eventually win the rook. So it's just completely hopeless for Black. Karjakin winning the position in the simplest possible way. So, very horrible loss for Caruana that he gets a lot of time to think about and try to bounce back from. So meanwhile, Karjakin has tied it up. Now, just how did he manage to catch Caruana? And Caruana was so far ahead. Well, for one thing, Fabiano slowed down. We saw how he missed that one-move win against Liren in round 9. That could have really given him a huge lead. He worked very hard to make something out of nothing in that game, all for naught. In the 10th round, He worked hard to hold off Mamedyarov, and then in round 11, he had a relatively short but difficult game against Kramnik when Kramnik uncorked a huge opening surprise, probably the theoretical development of the tournament, which hasn't really seen a whole lot of openings. So we're going to take a look at that game next. That's Caruana against Kramnik. Okay, so here we go. C4, well, doesn't really have much impact as we go into queen pawn. And no semi-tarish, but the triangle Slav. So Karjana plays e4, very combative move. And generally speaking, bishop b4 check, bishop d2, queen takes d4 happens. White sacrifices the pawn and becomes very, very super sharp. Right? Well, and that's happened like 2,000 to 3,000 times. Kramnik plays c5. It's not quite a novelty, but we might as well call it one. There's just like 4 games in the database. It's never been played by a strong international player, and no titled player on either side of this position. So really kind of cutting edge here. Well, Fabiano plays knight c5 and then knight c6, which has not been played even by Potzer, so we have a totally new position. All right. White could try knight b3 to hold on to things, but a5 is a good response. If a4, well, it's a little ugly, but black can also play bishop b4 check and take this pawn on d4 as this bishop is now defended. Bishop b4, knight takes b3, works out okay. So knight b3, a5, let's say white plays knight f3, a4, knight d2, black is able to take back the pawn and has quite a reasonable position. So on the surface, it doesn't look like there's really any refutation. Kramnik was kind of downplaying this opening afterwards, but it looks like it's pretty sound. Maybe knight f3 is the best answer, and then white goes into this endgame here, and king e7 to get out of the fork. Now, perhaps white should try knight c7 here. Rook b8 and then bishop f4. Now, black can also start with bishop b4 check, but white could just move the king and get the same position. All right, so now bishop b4 check, and now king e2 is probably a little bit more accurate than king d1 because it forces black to respect the threat of the discovered attack. King d1 is a potential check on the file, so black can probably play knight f6. It's rather complicated, but certainly king e2 looks like the stronger move. So let's get back to that. Knight c7, rook b8, bishop f4, bishop check, king e2, and now black has to play, I believe, bishop d6. Because he doesn't really have a good way to sacrifice material. Knight a6 is a threat. So bishop d6 takes, knight check, king back. Now white can play knight a7, bishop d7, king e3, knight h6. Black may well have sufficient compensation for the pawn. If white doesn't want to go pawn chasing, he can also just play for the majority with king e3. A6 just come back. So there's a queenside majority in endgame. It might be a little bit more pleasant for white. Certainly not a huge advantage. Maybe that's the best that white can do. The way Fabiano played it, bishop d2, bishop d7, and black just grabs this knight, and then it's basically dead equal. He fiend countered the bishop, but black just defends, and everybody brought out their pieces. The rook came to c-file. The rooks all got traded. Nothing happened from here. The only thing that happened from here is that they eventually liquidated into the pawn ending, which everybody knows I love, but it was a pawn ending where nothing happened. So Kramnik made a pretty easy draw with this novelty, and was really would have been a good moment for Caruana to put a win on the board with white just before having black against Karjakin, knowing that losing that game would mean the end of his lead, and that's what happened. Well, the other half of the equation is Karjakin. Now, meanwhile, he'd been creeping forward for a lot of the tournament after those two early losses. While back, he started by winning a pretty much a dead drawn position against Wesley So to get on the board. Then he evened his record, winning a game against the slightly on tilt Kramnik, and then came the charge. We saw what he did in round 12, and in round 11, Karjakin ground down Aronian with the black pieces. All right, so let's have a look at that. We'll hit the highlights of this game. And you notice the thing about Karjakin, he knows he needs to win games to get back in it, but he doesn't really compromise his style. He plays solidly. He doesn't look to play very aggressive openings with black, kind of classic draw with black strategy, but he's winning these games. He's taking advantage of his opponent's desire to win the game. All right, so here we have this 95 move. It's a position where as we go deeper, we shrink the number of games, but 95 was played in a game that Gabriel Sargsyan had with the white pieces. It was a teammate of Aronian, Olympic teammate of Aronian, so we can assume that that they may have talked about this game. In that game, Sargsyan put his knight on c3, but Aronian played knight on d2, so maybe they decided that it's better to keep the c file clear. It doesn't seem like white has all that much in any case, and I believe that the computer suggested black plays c5 directly, as he could get white's b pawn back in return for his b pawn. But Karjakin took his time, and starting out, black maybe has a little bit of white maybe has a slight edge. Maybe should have just dunked the knight into d6 right away and create that pass pawn. I'm not sure if the rook on d4 is helping anything, but eventually he does go in there. Black takes and sets up e5, so now he's got kind of a good blockade going. The knight is actually pretty good on f8, and he just maintains the pawn on c4 to keep a white rook out, and gradually the position becomes nicer for black. And Aronian is trying to make something happen. Of course, he's quite desperate in the tournament by now. G4. I don't know that this demonstration of forcing the G5 F5 that helps white in any way. If he gets his queen in, it'll be great, but not going to be easy. And black kind of seems to be gradually improving the position. A4. This turns out to be rather ill-fated as that pawn becomes a target. And this is a key moment in the game. He gives up the a pawn, doesn't really get any compensation for it. He actually should have played a5, and a key variation is that if king takes d6, there's bishop b4 check, king c7, and this could actually lead to a fairly long variation. Rook d6, queen b5. Seems to kind of stop white, but he can play queen d2. Black better simplify here. Rook takes. Now, a couple things. At first, it seems like, okay, white gave up a pawn, doesn't look so good. But really, black can't use that extra pawn because his king is too exposed. He can't really get winning chance unless white blunders. So one possible variation is queen. Unless black blunders, I meant to say. Queen b5, check. So black can come up, check. King c5. Too dangerous to take g6 because of c3, so we could see something like this. And then white could do a little bit of ring around the rosy here. And these checks. It should be good enough for a draw. And if black tries to win with the king b7, let's say, then queen g6, suddenly white is winning because now c3 is answered by queen g7. But black can take a draw at any time. So it's really a variation where, Aronian maybe wasn't able to work out that he would be able to hold it for sure. He wasn't going to be able to win it. So, he's just speculating. It seems that both, he and Kramnik have the same kind of thing, that they seem to always be very hopeful, and it's not always working to their advantage. So Karjakin, one thing about Karjakin, he has excellent technique, and he showed it in this game. He just doesn't give an inch to the queen and the bishop. So Levon tries to sneak in with the queen, but he gets shut down. Sergei gives back the e-pawn, but he doesn't let that. Okay, the queen gets in, but after queen e6, he's got no follow-up, and now c3. So now he basically he's willing to give up this pawn. All right, he gets his king nice and safe, and he takes the pawn on e2, and so he's got a clear extra pawn, and he plays accurately. Queen b5 is a very strong move. White really can't afford a queen trade. Queen c6, this is a horrible move for white because queen trade is fatal. The bishop is attacked, the f3 pawn is attacked, so white can't even maintain this material. And so basically black just wins everything. He takes everything, and then he just makes room for his king to come up. All right, so the king can come up this way, protected by all his material, and then he actually uses the king to help with the offense because now he's able to set up a queen trade. And after king h1, queen h3, black is up 4 pawns in the ending, and Aronian probably would have resigned much earlier if it had not been the candidates. But that's what Karjakin has been doing. He's been really very opportunistic and taking advantage of opponents' mistakes, and just getting a lot of positions his opponent maybe can hold, but not happening, and so he got right back in it. Round 12 had another game changer when Ding got on the board with his first win over Mamedyarov. That was huge because just one win was all he needed to do to draw even with his opponent, who had been in second place, and it brought him just a half a point back of the co-leader. So let's see how he did it. Basically, Ding Liren is also just being solid. He is not worried about racking up wins, even though it seemed like he was a little too far away from first place. He's just playing solidly. Now this semi-Tarish, I would say it seems to be the #1 queen pawn defense in this tournament. Kramnik has been playing it, and now Ding decides to try his hand at it as well. And in the old days, now when I was a kid, I remember knight c6, bishop c4, b5. This is Bobby Fischer playing against Spassky. And, white could play something like a3 if he wants to avoid the exchange of bishops. But now black isn't fighting for tempo anymore. They just trade the bishops. And the idea is knight is going to come to d7 and f6. And this just seems like a much smarter way to play. They used to put the knight on c6, and white would go d5, and then knight a5, bishop d3, pawn takes d5, e5. We saw like Tal-Polagaevsky and a bunch of other games. So the knight just comes to a more solid position, and it's not clear, how white is gonna get much out of this. So I think that Kramnik had a game against So early in this tournament with the same maneuver, knight h5. I'm not entirely sure that I understand it because the knight comes back to f6, but basically it's black gets has a solid position and is banking on the queenside majority, which eventually becomes very important in this game. Now we see rook e3, rook c7, and now the knight came back to d3. This is a moment where white could try d5. takes. Now black can't take with the knight or the bishop because white pins with queen d4, and there's no way to defend the knight. So white wins material. Bishop takes d5, queen d4 will also be the same story. So black is pretty much forced to play queen d6. We can see queen g3, and then maybe black moves his rook somewhere, like rook c8. This is a possible variation. Knight g4, takes, king f8, and d6. And black blocks the pawn with the rooks. And we get to a position that is probably slightly more pleasant for white, maybe a little bit drawish. Now, the thing is, Mamedyarov, I don't know, maybe he was trying to play responsibly because he knows he's not far from the lead. He doesn't want to draw. Probably feels like he needs to win to catch up to Caruana, not knowing that he's going to come back to him. But he just doesn't really do much in this game. He plays very patiently for a while, and that he ends up just to getting into trouble because he doesn't really maybe waits too long to make the move to get a safe position. So a5, black is getting the queen side rolling, and probably now he should go bishop d1 to make it harder for black to play knight d7. Then white could play d5 fairly effectively, and then not necessarily for advantage, but really to hold equality. After bishop c2, knight d7, black is actually starting to get the better of it as his queenside majority is becoming significant. And Mamedyarov probably pushes the king side a little bit too quickly with this move g5 because he has to take his queen a little bit out of position. And he tries to be aggressive with those pieces, but now he's running into problems here because black doesn't take back; he just pushes past, and the a pawn becomes very powerful. Mamedyarov tries for a desperate counterattack, but the problem is the rook on c5 is pinned, and so that Ding is able to just simply make a queen, allowing ef7. And now the problem is rook h5 is not legal. See, I try to make it, yeah, because it's pinned. That's the problem. So he goes queen h4 check, queen h6, then rook h5. And white would actually be okay in this position. He's only down in exchange, if not for the fact that black has queen a7 check, hitting the bishop. He takes the bishop, and then he's up a rook. So that's the sting at the end, and Ding wins. So the defense rests. Ding plays this very defensive game and gets the full point. Now, it's been a very interesting tournament for Ding because it was just a few days ago we were all wondering if he's going to be able to successfully pull off a Giri and draw every single game in the candidates. He did that easily in the first 8 rounds. Then it looked like he was dead lost against Caruana. Managed to draw there, but then in round 11, he was totally winning. So as you know, the kind of swindle that he pulled off against Caruana, multiply that to see what position Grischuk was able to hold against Ding. And then we're going to see, take a look at that, the biggest swindle of the whole event in round 11, Ding against Grischuk. I'm not going to go through the whole game, but give you a flavor of it. Starts out sedate enough. It looks like it's going to be an IQP position, but he never does take there. And white gets the center going. And Grischuk, well, he plays really on the edge in this game, it has to be said. He's been playing on the edge a lot in this tournament. That's how he plays. Interesting, the oldest players in the tournament are really taking the most risks, where some of the younger players are really kind of taking their time. But white builds up a very strong position. He comes through the middle, Boom. Black does not defend in the best way. I think queen c6 is better to give some threats in the long diagonal. Black is starting to actually experience some back rank problems. Bishop f6 was not so good, but even so, Black should take the knight on g5. But he runs into a lot of problems because of his backward development. The rooks become very strong in the position when the center gets open. But look what happens here. Rook c8 takes. That's fine. Bishop takes. Now, this position is about plus, according to the computer, plus 15, something like that. If white plays knight d8, tactics time, going for the back rank. And if, say, rook takes, then I think strongest move actually is rook takes d5. And basically black just cannot avoid mate on the back rank. So he plays, interestingly, he could also play rook takes d5, queen takes, and then knight d8. This is also effective. That's also really no defense to that. But he plays kind of a normal move, knight f4. It looks like black's position is going to collapse in any case. I mean, how can he possibly hold it? But he gets very resourceful, knight c1, and white plays a lot of second or third best moves. Like queen h5 was not as good as queen e3. And now I think this is a good moment to take on f6. Bishop f7, queen f7, check. This rook is hanging, so black has to make sure that that's defended. Check, and then queen g6, rook e7 is even worse. Is to go here, and then white can lift the rook. This is a little less obvious than some of the other things, but see that black really has no defense to his position. He's not even up any material. Actually down a pawn and just getting totally swamped. But it seems that Ding is maybe just a little too patient, and he just kept waiting, and he did win the exchange, but somehow Grischuk just kept hanging on, and they made time control. And if he plays bishop c3, he's not only up in exchange, but he has the bishop pair, and that's got to be ultimately winning. But he must have seen something. He thought something was going to happen by force, which turned out not to happen. Black walks into this pin, but threat of knight g5, knight g4, and somehow black was just able to get in time to hold everything together. And the best white could do was play his ending, and black basically held on to everything, and it ended up a draw. So, a lot of what ifs. What if Carlsen had played that one move win against Geary? What if Geary had won this? What I said Geary, didn't I? I meant Ding. Imitating Geary. But what if Ding had won this dominating position against Grischuk? It seemed like no big deal. He hadn't won any games at the tournament, but he would be now he'd be +2 and tied for the lead. But because he didn't win the game, Grischuk is also still up among the leaders with a chance for first place. All right. Well, the last game I want to show is a highly entertaining game between two stalwarts who have been taking it on the chin here. Aronian and Kramnik have both played spirited, ambitious chess. Aronian rather less successfully. He's been out of form. He's making bad decisions, and unfortunately, he's piled up zeros. I mean, I appreciate his fighting style, but it's a shame to see him struggle in such an important tournament. Kramnik has fared better, but perhaps is the more disappointed of the two because he started with 2 wins, and he was close to a third one against Caruana. He started off 2.5 out of 3. I think he almost had 3.5 out of 4 after that game. But somehow it's all went downhill. A lot of losses. I think he had 4 losses before he could win another game. It seems that he's been lacking objectivity on social media. There's been a lot of memes poking fun at Kramnik, believing that he's better or winning in in every position. But in this game against Aronian, he actually won a nice game and a fairly well played game. It was a fairly accurately played game, despite how strange it is. So we'll have a look at that one. Of course, Aronian always plays e4, e5. That's one reason why Kramnik can play e4 against him, because he knows who he's going to get. And he goes old school Italian game, knight c3. And Aronian plays a6. I guess he holds back d6 so that if white plays bishop g5, he can retreat the bishop to e7 to break the pin. So Kramnik goes knight d5 directly, and he offers his trade. It's, I guess, a somewhat pleasant position for white. Okay, b4, we see a demonstration on the queen side. I mean, really, the action is going to happen on the king side. Maybe, Vladimir is trying to just create a little bit of a distraction there to get going on the other side. And so a lot of moves happen. Rook b1. I mean, the rook isn't really going to do much over there. It's going to be the king side. All right, now we have something happening. Knight h4, c5, rook f1. Okay, so now white is loading up on the king side to get going there. Takes queen e1. He doesn't recapture, but he needs to defend the pawn on e3. Because if black takes the pawn on e3, he pins the rook and the queen comes over to defend. So he's ready to sacrifice stuff over there because he wants rook f6. So he plays d5, so the queen is defending. He takes back for the moment. Get rid of that, and now, all right, now we see some action with knight g6. Now Komodo tried to tell me that black could take here and answer queen g3 with queen d6, which seems absolutely bizarre to me. But then it eventually decided that rook d1 is strong for white. Okay, it seems like no human would consider this variation for black anyway, right? All right. So Aronian plays more sensibly, I think. Bishop e6, knight e5 takes, and now comes rook f6. That pawn comes forward. Check. King f8. The pawn's almost queening, so white retreats. Rook a7 to defend. Knight g6. Knight f4. Okay. So black has to go to h8 now. If he goes to f8, take the bishop, just simply take the rook. Because if black takes the bishop, then there's a check on b8, picking up the rook. All right. So he has to play king h8, king h7. If he goes king h7, knight h5 will be even stronger with a check on f6. So he has to go king h8, knight f5, f6, knight f6. He plays rook f8. Pinning the rook. We're going to see this is going to really not turn out well for black. Although the move is playable, he certainly could have also played rook d8, which puts the rook behind the passed d pawn. Okay, but after rook d8, queen f4, Levon would have to see the move bishop f5, double exclam, preparing to block the file with the bishop, block the check on h6 with the bishop, and if white takes, then black can make a queen, and this seems to be enough for equality. White can play the tricky move, queen back to f4, again threatening that mate, and we can see rook h7, rook takes, king h2, queen d6. So black gets the queens off before it's too late. Knight h7, king h7, and now black might even get some winning chances here, but white has a strong move, c4, attacking the rook, and the rook cannot attack the bishop either on d3 or b1 because of bishop c2. So we're going to peter out into an ending, something like takes, rook d4, something like this, which leads to a position I'm certain is going to be a draw with no winning chances really for either side. So that was a possible draw. not the only one, but rook d8 was an option. Rook f8 is playable. Queen f4, rook h7, queen e5, and now comes queen c7. I mean, this is almost an incomprehensible blunder, really, just allowing a forced checkmate. So he obviously had to do better than that, and he could have done better with the move rook g7. Seems forced. Obviously, makes sense to block the diagonal. He didn't want to give up this bishop so easily. Bishop e6, he could play rook g5. Queen c6 also seems possible, threat made. And after e4, rook g5, we get the same type of variation. And now here, among other things, white could play knight h5, check. But it's not quite the same as the game. Here it's only perpetual check, which black has to take. Because if he plays king g8, knight f6 check, and rook h7 mates. If he comes up king g6, rook g7 takes, bishop f7, that forces queen g6, and white can play bishop takes queen and rook d7 with probably winning rook ending. So go back to this position here, rook f7, king h8, and it's perpetual check. So game could have ended in a draw, but queen c7, knight e8, discovered check, and Aronian resigns because queen takes e5, rook f8, bishop g8, rook g8 mate, and any other move just takes a little bit longer to mate because either white is going to take the f8 rook with check next move or take the bishop with check, and the black position falls apart. So a rather nice game for Kramnik. He really went for it in that game, and Aronian was actually kind of hanging with him for a while, but in the end made a terrible blunder there, and Kramnik gets the full point. One of the more interesting games in the tournament, I feel. All right, so with 2 rounds to go, this is the story. Karjakin and Caruana at 7 points. Karjakin holds the head-to-head tiebreaker, shades of the last candidates tournament. I hope it doesn't come down to that. You know, I'd hate to see Caruana again miss out because he's tied with Karjakin and loses the tiebreak. I'm sure that he never imagined that the way this tournament was going, never imagined that could happen, but it must be in his nightmares now. Meanwhile, Mamedyarov drops down into a tie for 3rd place with Ding and Grischuk at 6.5. So you've got 5 players within a point. Within a half a point of each other. So it should be an exciting finish. I know I'll be watching. I hope you guys will. It should be very exciting. All right, well, that does it for rounds 10 through 12. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. I hope you enjoyed the candidates recap. We will have one more recap with Alex Yarmolenski, I believe, on the 29th after the tournament is over. And, of course, I'll have my my regular show tomorrow on Monday. So I hope you guys had as much fun watching the recap as I had putting it together. It's a fascinating event. It's really good stuff when we have the candidates come around. So I hope that you will be, watching the shows and following the games on ICC. Take care, everybody.